So we do now welcome Roger Trigg back to speak to us, who's Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University, and he's going to speak to us about, indeed, postmodernism and philosophy and science. So thank you very much, Roger.
Right, well, thank you very much. Now, yesterday I was talking about how important I thought that reality was, the notion of reality for science and for religion. And I said, and I think a lot of people agreed, that the practitioners of science in laboratories actually believe there is a reality that they're investigating. They don't think they're just going there making up stories. In the same way, and perhaps more importantly even, religious people don't think they're just listening to stories. They actually think, when they worship, that they're actually taking note of what they believe is true. And truth matters, and if they thought it didn't, if they think that all they're doing is taking part in some long-established ritual, why go on doing it? And unless there's an answer to the question, why go on doing it, and a sociological answer isn't really very satisfactory, unless there's a good intellectual reason, obviously they may not. Now, this brings up the whole question of reality, very perhaps abstruse philosophical topic, but it isn't really. It's just saying that there is something which, in fact, can be the measure of our beliefs, whatever they are. We can be wrong, just as we can be right. And the risk of trying to be right is that we can make mistakes, and it's in fact the inevitable fate of human beings, I suppose, to be fallible and to make mistakes. Science flourishes on mistakes, really, once they're recognized. So the whole idea of truth is important. Last night in the discussion, very briefly, the idea of human nature came up. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that now, but I also would just like to point out that that is a very important notion too, that we're all human, that being human matters. Now, there's a lot that could be said about that, and indeed science perhaps can contribute. I mean, science can sometimes, through evolutionary biology in one way or another, explain something of what human nature might be. Not everything, but something. Now, those two notions, reality and human nature, are two very broad philosophical topics that underpin the writings of a lot of philosophy, at least traditionally. And there have been two ideas that have preoccupied me a lot over the last 30 years. And in my writing, I've been very well aware that there is another side to this, that there are people who want to say, there is no such thing as reality. There is no such thing as being human. There are different cultures, there are different beliefs. But there isn't one thing that holds for everybody. And basically, that view is relativism. It's the view that what is held to be true, or even the views that we have of ourselves, relate to the group of which we're a member. Now, I think one of the great problems about relativism is actually defining what we mean by that group. It's very easy, actually, to think that relativism arises when there's a lot of disagreement, and so if you find that there's a disagreement, that means that that's a sign that there are different groups there. But nobody agrees with everybody about everything, and I think if you push that line of argument, if you think disagreement is always the sign of perhaps belonging to a different social grouping, a different practice, or however you define it, in the end, you're liable to find yourself in a social grouping or a social practice composed of one person, namely yourself. In other words, relativism is on a slippery slope down, because if you say all beliefs are relative to people who agree with me, I think probably the only person I'm absolutely sure agrees with myself is probably me, and perhaps even I don't always. So there is therefore indeed a real problem here about defining the group. Sometimes you can define a group independently of the disagreements. I suppose you can say, well, there's the Catholic Church, it's a human institution, we can see what it is, and we can identify it apart from particular beliefs about abortion or whatever that may be held. And so that there are sociological criteria. But once you begin to use disagreement and divergence as part of the sign of a disagreement, of a divergence in social grouping, as I said, you're liable to get into difficulty. So I find relativism a problem. But relativism is very deep-rooted in philosophy. In fact, it's almost as old as philosophy. I said yesterday that I thought that philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, or at least that's been said in the past, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. Plato's main opponents, I would go so far as to say, were relativists. I mean, one of his main targets was Protagoras. And one of the reasons that Plato was writing his philosophy was to establish the fact that there was such a thing as truth and reality, and particularly moral truth, because obviously he was intensely aware that there were some people who would say that morality is just the custom of the particular place you're in. Morality is just the custom of the city. And indeed, of course, relativism flourished as people in the ancient world, particularly the Greek world of the 5th century BC, became aware of differences. Athens became aware of Sparta. Well, all right, it was another Greek state, but there were differences. They took off their clothes to do exercises in Sparta. They didn't in Athens. But there are deeper differences between Greece and Persia, Greece and Egypt. And a lot of those were chronicled by Herodotus. And as these very deep divergences of religion and practice were chronicled, and as indeed, I mean, there were Greek city-states in Asia Minor, they were coming up against people who were living very differently. Obviously, the question is, well, who's right? Are we right to live like this, or are they right? Which should it be? Does it matter? And the relativist would say, well, each to his own. A bit like saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. This is our custom, that's theirs. And there was a tremendous argument between those who thought that nomos, custom, was prior, and those who wanted to say that nature, physis, the root of physics, was important. So this argument goes right back to the beginnings of science and the beginnings of philosophy, because, of course, the very early thinkers in Asia Minor were, in a sense, philosopher-scientists. They were philosophizing and at the same time making the first faltering steps to making scientific statements about what the world is made of. Now, Plato argued very fiercely about relativism, particularly in his dialogue, the Theaetetus, and he provided, I thought, one of the knockdown arguments about it, namely that it is self-contradictory. Relativists, I think, in the end, can't even assert relativism without assuming the very truth that they're denying. It's easy, actually, to caricature relativism as the doctrine that it is true that there is no such thing as truth. Some people almost get to that point of saying that. But Protagoras was slightly more sophisticated, but in the end, in arguments with him, Socrates, Plato's mouthpiece, is trying to show that actually, in the end, Protagoras is aware that there are truths in the world. There are, in a sense, faults and diseases that he's trying to ameliorate amongst human beings, I mean intellectual ones, that he is, in fact, assuming the very truth that he wants to deny. And indeed, I mean, if you take the philosophy of the social sciences, and you can get a lot of relativists there, and they can say, well, there are different social realities. But that's, of course, a non-relativist statement. It's standing back and assuming, again, that you can stand back from all social realities and look at them and see the reality which is constituted by the differences. So it is very difficult, in the end, to state relativism consistently, because I think, as Plato did, that language presupposes the opposite. That language, in a sense, presupposes that it's referring to a world that we all have access to. That, in fact, it's important that language, therefore, is something that is a means of communication, not obfuscation, and even a means of communication between cultures. I mean, translation is not an obvious thing. Why is it we can translate between languages? Because they're all about the same world and they're all human languages. Once you say they're not about the same world, how can we communicate? So I think all of our intellectual disciplines actually presuppose the falsity of relativism. And I've been saying this for over 30 years, and over that period, relativism has grown and grown. I hope there's not a connection between the two, but relativism is actually more explicitly embraced now than it used to be. In philosophical books, relativism used to be mentioned, but never approvingly. Even people I would think were relativists were always trying to say, well, no, I'm not a relativist. I mean, I'm saying this, but that's not relativism, because relativism was like sin. It's something you wouldn't actually indulge in, you would think. Now, actually then, you find now, the reverse is the case, that some people are quite willing to embrace relativism as a doctrine, and will say quite explicitly, no, that is quite true, quite right. And again, as I say, I mean how you use those words deliberately, because if they're asserting something as a doctrine, it's very difficult for them consistently to be using it as a rational argument without assuming the falsity of what they're saying. I mean, if they're consistent relativists, they're saying, and again, this is a Platonic argument, it's true for me that there's no such thing as truth, but that means that's not necessarily true for you, and it doesn't really matter, does it? Because you can say, well, that's very interesting, false. It's a very, very interesting fact about you. I had a deprived childhood in that I didn't have bananas, so I don't like bananas. That dates me rather. But I mean, that's a fact about me. But I'm not going to say there's a cosmic truth about bananas. Well, in the same way, putting it round the other way, if there's no such thing as truth but only people's beliefs, and it's just true for them, they believe that certain things, it's a fact about them, very interesting psychological fact, but of no conceivable real interest to me. If you want bananas, good luck to you. But if you believe something is true but it's only true for you, why should I take any notice? So taking away the notion of reality actually as well undermines the notion of reason, because actually what's a reason in my society, my tradition, my practice, whatever the current word would be, isn't by definition going to be a reason for you. What I think is true for me. What I think is a good reason is a reason for me. Can't offer it to you because it may not be for you. And that's what relativism is saying. Now, what's all this got to do with postmodernity? Very simply, postmodernity is a relativist doctrine. Now, what is postmodernism? I think to understand it, one has to think what it's reacting against. But first, let me just emphasize how widespread a phenomenon it is now. I said yesterday I thought there's a kind of 30-year gap between what philosophers and others say in the universities and what then seeps out to other disciplines and other people. And so positivism seeped out and eventually affected other disciplines just at the time when it was being given up by philosophers. It's about 30 years now since postmodernism got going. I mean, the intellectual history of it is, like a lot of peculiar things, it comes from France, I suppose. And it comes particularly from the work of people like Michel Foucault. I apologize to any French people here, by the way. That's meant to be a joke, in case you don't understand English irony, but still. Anyway, Michel Foucault was very influenced by Nietzsche. And there is a kind of linear descendance of postmodernism back to Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche famously said that everything is interpretation. There is no truth, no fact. Everything is interpreted. Now, and I'll say in a moment, of course, that there's an intellectual history before that too. But certainly Nietzsche and then Foucault have been very influential in mentioning that and stressing that Foucault is wanting to stress the fact that there are different traditions, different, he uses the technical term episteme at one point, different frames of knowledge, and very often operating under systems of power, so that he's operating a rather sociological notion here. And indeed, let this be a warning to us that the more you discount reason, whether in religion or science or anywhere else, the more you open up a vacuum that's going to be filled by what? Well, the only thing is power. Because if rational argument isn't available, then, and I want to convince people, then I might as well clobber them if I'm stronger. And that really is the only alternative, if there's any kind of contact between people. Again, this was something that worried Plato. The Republic famously starts with the question, what is justice? Is it just the interest of the stronger? Now, Plato, of course, thought, no, there are basic truths about justice. Justice is an absolute standard. But he saw the danger of denying that the danger was that the strong will win. And now, notice how Nietzsche actually believed that. He thought that, one of his criticisms of Christianity was that it favoured the weak and held back the strong. So this is something that one has to realise, that actually reason is itself terribly important as an antidote to power. Indeed, it was one of the reasons in the 17th century, again at the dawn of science, I think, why a lot of philosophers were trying to emphasise the role of reason so much. I don't think it's a coincidence, actually, that the Royal Society and the beginnings of modern science occurred, in fact, were founded particularly at the time after there'd been a terrible civil war in this country, because people had seen what happens when passions let loose and power takes over and people literally fight it out. Isn't there a better alternative? Can't reason do something about it? Now, postmodernism is pulling back from that again. Now, postmodernism is actually very much in the culture around us, as I was saying. As I was coming up on the train from London the other night, I bought the London Evening Standard, not a paper I like very much, but I did notice in there, there was one writer suggesting that we have a postmodern government in this country at the moment. I thought, well, if you get the terms postmodern in the London Evening Standard, it just shows how far down the line we've got with it. And probably it shows that in the universities it's just about run its course. But what did he mean by postmodern government? It's interesting to see what people have grasped in postmodernism and how they're applying it. What he meant by a postmodern government was a government where there's no idea of collective cabinet responsibility, that each member of the cabinet is telling a different story. And he said this is actually, from their point of view, a very good idea because they're appealing to different constituencies. So one member of the government can appeal to people who are pro-Israeli, while simultaneously somebody can say the opposite and appeal to people who've got more sympathy with, say, Lebanon. And he said, that's good politics because you're keeping everyone happy, as long as they don't read what the other person's saying. But the point is there's no such thing as truth there anymore. There are just different stories being spun. And I suppose the motif of postmodernism, and put forward by, again, Frenchman Lyotard, is that there is no such thing as a grand narrative. The very use of the term narrative is indicative. So there are different stories we can entertain, but no grand narrative that's overarching. No one story that God made everything, no one story that science can explain everything, no one story that in the end we will reach the classless society. There are all these grand narratives, whether Christian, science, Marxist. There have been a lot of them, of course, and the postmodernists are very suspicious of them in ways that I will describe. But again, as I said, when postmodernism is in the air we breathe and our surroundings, there is such a thing, of course, as postmodern architecture. And again, it's reacting to modern architecture. Modern architecture, I suppose, is exemplified by people like Le Corbusier, who built machines fit for living in. the idea that somehow it's immoral to have any kind of irrelevant decoration on buildings, that buildings must be severely functional and express clearly the purpose for which they're built. Very much science-based in a way, very rational. Postmodernism, on the other hand, is much more playful. I mean, you can use a bit of this motif, a bit of that, have a Byzantine front and a Georgian back, or just build a Georgian house if you feel like it, do something else down the road. There's no overarching idea that there is one thing you must do. You can pick from different traditions. No one tradition is better than another. And makes for a funny mixture of architecture. But it's, and of course, I mean, there's a good side to it, because if you like traditional Georgian architecture, it enables you to build it. And so you can pick and choose very much. Nothing is imposed. And I think, again, you see that there is the feeling amongst a lot of people putting forward postmodern ideas in various contexts, that the idea of a grand narrative imposes a standard on people and is stifling and somehow totalizing in its effect. And the word totalizing is consciously linked, I think, to totalitarianism. That the idea of a free society would be one where people are free not just to choose how to live, but to choose what will be true for them. Now, this is a very radical view of freedom. It's not, I think, a view of freedom that I am particularly attracted to, because I think that kind of radical freedom becomes so great that actually there's no reason for choosing one thing rather than another. And I always hate being in a position where actually there's no reason for choosing. You've got an absolute, again, somebody mentioned existentialism this morning, it gets a bit like that, an existential choice. You've got an absolute blank slate or blank canvas, and you can just choose. Nothing constrains you. And I think that's a very worrying situation. I mean, sometimes if I drive into a car park and there's one space, I know where I've got to go. If I drive into a car park and there's no car park there and there are myriad spaces, I get quite confused. Where on earth should I park? Why? There's no reason for parking in this space rather than that one. Well, postmodernism, I think, almost generates that kind of view that because you have absolute freedom and it doesn't matter what you choose, why should you choose one thing rather than another? Now, I've been talking about postmodernism, but of course, the important thing is that postmodernism only makes any sense if you understand what it's reacting against. I remember it was about 20 years ago, I was talking to a very famous French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who's dead now, very leading French philosopher, but a Christian philosopher, a very sensible writer. And he said that the point about postmodernism was that you had to define modernity. It's no good just talking about being after something unless you've defined what it is you're after. So what is modernity? What is it that they're objecting to? Well, I've already suggested in a way that this kind of grand narrative, the imposition of one view, and in the case of architecture, perhaps a rather kind of science-based architecture, dictated by technology. And I think this links very much to the 18th century view of reason and the 18th century view of science, which developed on in the 19th century. It was a time of great optimism. One of the things about modernity, I think, is that it had a strong belief in truth, but also a strong belief in progress, strong belief in improvement. If you read 19th century novels, there's a lot about improvement. But there's also a lot about progress, and I think a lot of people latched onto Darwinism because they linked it with ideas of progress, of everything evolving to become better. Well, that may not be a very sensible way to look at biology, but certainly transferred to political contexts, a lot of people thought that there was a notion of progress that you could actually, through perhaps science, improve things, make things better. And of course medicine is a good example of how it looks as if the application of science inevitably improves things. So there was this tremendous optimism about science and about the use of reason, I suppose it's linked with the idea that humans will use reason properly, that reason will in fact be an instrument always of progress rather than reverse. Now, I suppose the experience of the 20th century led people to realize that that wasn't inevitably so, that science can be used for bad purposes as well as good purposes. Science can be used for gas ovens for Jews and others. Science can be used to produce more effective hydrogen bombs, etc., etc. And nowadays, science and technology can be blamed for all kinds of apparent evils as much as praised for what they're bringing. So there's, I think, a much greater suspicion of science, a much greater unwillingness to take it at face value. I'm sure in the 19th century people just assumed, on the whole, that science brought knowledge which will bring progress, and social progress as well. It was, of course, Socrates who thought that virtue was knowledge. If you knew, you would do what was right. I think that's a highly optimistic view of human nature, that mere knowledge alone is no guarantee that people will do what's right or use it effectively or, in any sense, do something that is going to make things better. So we have a situation now where, in fact, people are suspicious of this modern view of science, this modern view of a self-sufficient reason, which claimed truth, claimed that we were ever more getting nearer the truth, and for that reason things would be better. It's easy to get cynical and assume, well, no, these claims about truth are just groups of people using their power to impose their will, and that's roughly what Foucault was saying. And that therefore means that the whole notion of modernity has come into disrepute. And I've been putting it very much in, I think, in sociological and historical terms, because I think great social movements like this aren't just intellectual. I mean, they're fueled by all kinds of things. And that's, in a way, why postmodernism, I suppose, is important, because it isn't just something that's going on in seminar rooms. It's actually something that's gripping people, whether they realize it or not, in their suspicions about where science is taking us. And of course, for those of us who actually think that the pursuit of knowledge is a good thing and that science itself is something worth pursuing, that is exceptionally dangerous. I think we were saying last night that sometimes extremes can, in a sense, feed off each other. The particular example was intelligent design, where you get two extremes and there's a whole middle ground that gets forgotten. But here the same thing applies, I think, that an absolute unthinking allegiance to science and to reason as being only expressed through science, because this is what happened in the 18th century, that a notion of reason became identified very much with materialism. I mean, just think how the word rationalism very often is almost synonymous with atheism. Now that shouldn't be the case, because a rationalist should be somebody who uses reason. Why should that be anti-religious? And there's something going on there that's very peculiar. I mean, a rationalist oughtn't necessarily to be an atheist. A rationalist ought to be somebody who's using reason. But, you see, once you get that kind of identification, it's not surprising, again, that some people will react against it and say, well, we don't believe in that kind of human reason then. Now, if I could just go back again to the 18th century for a moment, I've emphasized the way in which relativists tend to look at people and their beliefs rather than what the beliefs are about, because they're saying ultimately there is no such thing as truth. There are people with beliefs, people with commitments. And I think it's interesting to see that the philosophical roots of this were, or at any rate were, if they were not wholly there, they were very much helped by the work of Kant in the 18th century with his so-called Copernican revolution. Though he believed rationality was universal, he very much placed the emphasis on humans and their reactions, their conceptual schemes, their categorical frameworks, rather than what those were about. So he was not so much talking about the objectivity of space and time as our concepts of space and time and the way in which we use our categories. And so reality, although he didn't want to deny it, receded. So reality were things in themselves, but what's important to us is the things as they appear to us. So we really are dealing with phenomena, not noumena. Now, that kind of step in philosophy, I think, is always dangerous. If you try and keep something but it's not doing very much, in Wittgensteinian terms it's a wheel that isn't turning anything, the next step will be to discard it altogether. And things in themselves that really we can't reach look as if they're a bit like that. And sure enough, you see, post-Kantians are very ready to jettison the idea of reality and to stick with simply the notion of belief and concept and phenomena. But of course, once you do that, you haven't got any regulative framework to keep you on the straight and narrow. There isn't one thing that we're all aiming at. All you've got are lots of different beliefs. And if you've only got lots of different beliefs, perhaps that's what we're stuck with. And I can see that the step from someone like Kant to a more relativist position saying there are different categorical frameworks, different conceptual schemes, isn't very great. Once you forget that the conceptual schemes are meant to be about something, all you're left with is the fact of different views, different beliefs, different concepts. And the more you emphasize different conceptual schemes, the more you're going to separate them, and it's going to be very difficult to see how they can ever communicate with each other. Jumping considerable time, you'll see in the philosophy of science how this happens with the work of Thomas Kuhn in his famous Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he emphasized scientific theory to the detriment of talking about what the theories were about. Now, one can argue a lot about how far he's a relativist. I mean, there are a lot of relativist tendencies in what he's saying. He certainly can't take any account of scientific progress very easily. I remember 30 years ago hearing him talk about the difficulties of him being able to do that. He realized it was a problem for him. But what you get in Kuhn is different concepts, different theories, different scientific traditions, and then, in his words, they're incommensurable. You can't bring them together. And this is, I think, a very typical feature of any kind of relativist setup, that the whole thing begins to break up into different schemes, different categories, different concepts, and there's no bridge between them. Because actually you need the notion of a bridge to understand other people. And I mean, why should you translate a language unless you think the language is about the same world as you are in? Unless you think the person is human like you, there aren't any points of contact. So you've got to have points of contact. You've got to have these bridges. Now, Kuhn was getting rid of them, and postmodernists typically jettison them all. So all you have are different stories, different narratives, different traditions. They're not altogether clear, actually, as I've said, about what the differences are, but it's the fact of difference, the fact of divergence. So that somehow it's taken to be a virtue that there is diversity. But it's a diversity that can become so radical that we can't even recognize how diverse people are. We can't communicate with them and we can't understand them. And that is, of course, immensely worrying. If you take the Kuhnian project too far, I mean, you destroy science. I think people following him after, I mean, were pushing the project to the extent that one wondered why there was any point in doing science and why Western science was in fact any better than any other form of life or any other practice. And in the work of people like Feyerabend, the answer was, well, it isn't really. And that is very unsettling. So there's a dethroning of science. Now, of course, I was talking yesterday about positivism, and for anti-positivists, this can look immensely attractive. We've got the scientists on the run, they might think. Science is no longer the be-all and end-all. It's no longer exerting a totalitarian sway. It's no longer claiming monopoly rights on reason. science is being put in its place. It's just one group of people. We're another group. We don't have to listen to what they say. Hooray. Now, of course, and therefore, people who are opposed to positivism can very easily become postmodernists. It's the question of one extreme generating the other. Just as, I suppose, a reaction to postmodernism and the chaos it seems to engender, the undermining of reason, might be a determination to stick with this very scientific view of things, that science is the only way we can understand anything. If we let slip our commitment to science at all costs, we'll get landed in this morass of postmodernism where anything goes. So each of them, you can see, is pointing out faults in the other. And the problem is that if you think that they're alternatives and there's nothing else, that there is a problem. But of course, that isn't the case. Well, then, postmodernism is typically casting doubt on the idea of a universal rationality, and I suppose it's that in modernity that it's really complaining about. The idea that there's a rationality, and linked to that, the idea that there is a common reality. It's stressing the fact of difference, different epochs, different traditions. Each has its own standards. Now, I said the result is relativism, but one of my complaints about relativism, actually, is that I don't think it's the final terminus. Because I've said again, well, if there are lots of traditions or lots of choices, why choose one rather than the other? And I think, actually, if you really engage with relativism, one begins to think, well, it doesn't matter what one believes, why believe anything? And so, actually, relativism is a pretty good way of getting into nihilism, where you say nothing matters at all. And, of course, it is no coincidence that Nietzsche was a self-confessed nihilist. Now, again, there are lots of arguments on what precisely is meant by that, but certainly it's clear that he's denying the kind of reality that Christians would want to affirm. He was denying the kind of reality that people like philosophers like Plato wanted to talk about. Indeed, he referred to both Plato and Christianity collectively as those great viaducts of corruption. I don't know where he would stand to actually have that view, actually, because, again, if you think that there's such a thing as corruption, you must have a notion of something good and something bad. Where are you standing to make that kind of division? And again, that's just an illustration of how you can't make statements very easily if you're a relativist or a nihilist without assuming some overall standard, some overall measure. Now, one person I've quoted on the sheet that I gave to in a fairly new book called Nihilism and Emancipation is the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo. I've quoted that really because he's expounding postmodernism, but what particularly attracted me to the book was that he makes no bones about the fact that this is nihilism. He's even got it in his title. So he isn't merely mouthed about that, he knows exactly where he's going. And he refers to the dissolution of the principle of reality into the manifold of interpretations. Very Nietzschean view. There's no such thing as what is the case, it's only people interpreting. And involved in this is the removal of metaphysics. Of course, metaphysics is the great bête noire of postmodernists because it would be totalizing, it's suggesting that there's a common reality, and that is somehow imposing something on us. And he also talks about the reduction of the sacred to human dimensions. That's inevitable. You're going to think of, not of God, but of people's belief about God, people's reactions to religious things, to the divine. He says, in all fields, including science, truth itself is becoming an affair of consensus, listening, participation in a shared enterprise, rather than one-to-one correspondence with the pure, hard objectivity of things. Truth is becoming an affair of consensus. I suppose one of the philosophers who's put forward in the Anglo-American world the notion of postmodernity as much as anyone else was Richard Rorty, who was writing more about 10 years ago, really. He was combining postmodernity, interestingly enough, with the American pragmatist tradition. And he was linking truth with consensus, truth with a fact of agreement. Now, pragmatists thought that there would be one final agreement in science, but if you give a postmodernist spin to that, you could see that there can be lots of different consensuses, lots of different agreements. And in that case, again, truth is just what we agree to be true. So it's the fact of agreement that's important. There's a lot of that in modern philosophy. Again, let me just mention quickly the later Wittgenstein, who would stress again that in language games that agreement is the basis of our judgments, that agreement is the starting point. Not truth, not metaphysics, not what we're agreeing about. So you remove the target and just take the fact of what humans are doing. Of course, Vatimo makes all this sound very tolerant. An affair of consensus, listening, participation. It sounds also reasonable, listening to other people. I always get fed up, by the way, with Anglican bishops I meet who say we must listen to people. I must never tell anyone anything. And I mean, I thought, well, if there's no point in being a bishop unless you can tell somebody something, I would have thought. But still, I mean, in a way, that's the postmodernist attitude. You've just got to listen. There's no truth, but we must just share and participate. But that kind of reasonable view isn't really borne out by postmodernism, because in the end, as with all relativism, there's no point in being reasonable. If you can get your way by clobbering somebody, by using your power, why not? There's no reason against it, because there's no reason. Now, all the time, we're up against, of course, the fact of pluralism. And I think a lot of postmodernity, as I was saying at the beginning, gains its plausibility because we're so much aware of difference of belief, just as the ancient Greeks were aware that Egyptians and Persians had very different beliefs from themselves. So nowadays, we're all the more aware of differences of beliefs. The world has been brought together so much more by television and air transport and so on, and immigration. And so the fact of pluralism is really on our doorstep. Now, I'm using pluralism in a sociological way. Just it is a fact that there are many people with many different beliefs. But that can slide, pluralism can slide from a sociological fact to an epistemological fact to relativism. And I'm always a bit worried when people start talking about pluralism, because it can very easily become the relativist notion that, well, not just are there many people with different beliefs, but there is no right belief. There's nowhere to stand. You shouldn't criticize other people. Everyone has a right to their own belief. Vatimo makes a lot about the fact that one should be tolerant, one should in fact not impose one's beliefs on others, and he seems to think that his view encourages that the idea of truth somehow can encourage intolerance. Now, of course, the notion of objective truth can be misused, and sometimes when I talk about objective truth, the Spanish Inquisition and Lenin can loom their heads. I mean, people can believe in truth and also believe that they've got a right to make other people believe it. But that doesn't follow at all. If you really believe that there is such a thing as an objective truth, it doesn't follow that you've got the whole truth. It may be that the other person has. I would have thought it as much an argument for actually rational consideration of other people's views as the imposition of one's own. And as an aside, of course, the idea that tolerance is a virtue of relativism is nonsense, because relativism can't claim non-relative virtues. If you really ought to be tolerant, that shows relativism is false, because there's one thing that's true, namely, you ought to be tolerant. So there's no reason, according to relativism. I mean, if I'm to be tolerant, if I'm a member of an intolerant society, that's my standard. That's what we believe. And if we impose our will on others, well, it's true for us that we should. There's no reason why people ought to be tolerant unless you've got some rational argument which can apply to everybody and doesn't depend on just the mere fact of people's beliefs. Well, one thing that I find surprising, but it's undoubtedly a fact, is the way in which some religious people have welcomed postmodernism. Now, of course, postmodernism is a slippery concept, and it can mean all kinds of things. Sometimes it's been used to mean post-foundationalism, which means that knowledge isn't on neutral foundations like sense data, but that's a particular epistemological doctrine, and it doesn't follow that if you don't believe in sense data that you then are a postmodernist at all. But some religious people have welcomed postmodernism simply because, as I've indicated before, it stops science from obtaining a monopoly on reason. Because science can't criticize religion, because each is in their own form of life, or their own language game, their own tradition, their own whatever it is. But this creates a problem, because if there's no such thing as truth, and science can't claim it, so science can't criticize religion, of course it means that religion can't claim truth either. Faith can't claim truth. One religion can't give a reason why people should belong to it rather than other religions, or no religion at all. So the whole thing begins to fall to bits. In other words, people have reacted to strong claims of scientism by seizing a postmodernism that undermines not just science but reason and truth, and that undermines religion as well. So it was, as we've heard before, Dennett who talked about the corrosive acid of Darwinism. Postmodernism is a deeply corrosive acid. It eats away at all reason, all point in belief. And it destroys science, yes, it's bound to, but it destroys all religion too. It's bound to. Religion, any religion, just becomes one tradition amongst many. Science is just one tradition amongst many, no better than astrology or witch doctors or anything else. But you see, this is overkill. Neither science nor religion then are of universal significance, and those not already committed to them can have no reason for changing their minds, and those who are committed to them have no reason for continuing their commitment. So we're in a deeply difficult situation, and this is why I say that this decrying of reason inevitably ends up with a kind of nihilism that leaves us totally helpless. It destroys everything. It's all right, it destroys the overconfidence and overbearing nature of science. It may attack the overbearing authority of some religion, but it does so at great cost, because it gives everybody no reason for believing anything at all. You're either in a tradition or not. Incidentally, of course, if we were really locked in a tradition and unaware of anything outside, none of this would apply anyway. It's only because we are aware of the fact of different traditions, and that's a non-relativist claim, that we get worried about this. I often think if you were living in a 19th century English village in a very settled way of life, never meeting anybody from any other nation or other religion, things would seem obvious. Things would be just taken for granted. Things would seem part of the natural order of things. It's only when you stand back and see that not everything is like that, and it doesn't have to be like that there, that questioning arises. But that doesn't so much lead to relativism, because it's depended on the non-relativist recognition of the fact of difference. And the fact of difference, as I said, is a fact. It's an objective fact. Well, postmodernism, therefore, I'm saying, is the enemy of science. It's the enemy of religion. It's the enemy of all rational discourse. It's relativist. it's therefore, in a way, deeply self-destructive. It's the enemy of itself in the end. I mean, why be a postmodernist? You can't give a reason. With the attack on rationality, there's no reason for believing one thing rather than another. And let me just reiterate this point about tolerance and liberty, because I do think actually this is the main reason why people want to be relativists, that they think somehow there's something objectionable about claiming truth, because it somehow might imply that somebody else is mistaken, and that this is at best impolite and at the worst the first step to actually attacking them in some way, perhaps physically. And that seems to me to be total nonsense, that actually we can respect other people, we can respect their freedom, we should be tolerant of other people because of our beliefs. That actually relativism, as I've said, can't value freedom as an intrinsic good. It can't preach tolerance as something everyone ought to observe. If it does either of those things, it is denying itself. So far from upholding liberty and tolerance, like so much else, it removes any reason for believing in them. Well, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Roger, for that very, very clear exposition of postmodernity. So Mustafa is going to be the first to ask a question. Can we
Thank you for this very helpful talk. And Father Newhouse, an American Catholic theologian, he speaks about the same issue. And he has a nice phrase, I just want to quote that. He says, tolerance is not indifference to differences, as if differences make no difference. And, at one place he speaks about the importance of relativizing the relativizers. And do you think, I mean, and also the Pope, the Benedict XVI, is talking about this issue very quite, quite
I was
remarkably.
very pleased to see the Pope's been saying things that I've been saying for a long time.
Yeah.
I thought, well, it must be right then.
So, and do you see a strategy to relativize the relativizers? I mean, do you suggest a method to be taken and so on?
Well, I just think that if you turn their view on themselves, it's incoherent. I mean, I think that in the end they're not saying anything. I think that I'm not sure what's really meant by relativizing the relativizers. That kind of complete relativism cannot be stated without undermining itself, because all of our language assumes that there is a truth. We can't teach language, we can't learn language, we can't communicate with each other unless we assume we're talking about something that's independent of ourselves. If I say to a little child, that's red, that's a car, I'm assuming that the child can see what I see and picks it out. But that only works if there is something there, independent of me, against which and the child can identify it. Of course, it assumes the child has the same kind of physical and intellectual abilities that I have. So again, human nature enters into it. If you had the archetypal Martian, they may not see red as we see red. And so again, human nature is important too. But all of these things are built into the assumption of any kind of common life. Now, language is archetypally part of our common life. And funnily enough, I mean, sometimes you've had people putting forward relativist views in language, even linguists. There was Benjamin D. Whorf, an American, who showed in great detail how the American Hopi Indians thought very differently and spoke very differently from us, that they divided up the world very differently, and he explained it very clearly in English, and which actually nullified what he was saying, because he was able to identify and explain the differences. Now, he couldn't have done that if there was real linguistic relativity. There would be a total inability. I mean, I'm sure if you had, as I said, the Martian with the Martian's language, there would probably, it might be very difficult to correlate a human language with that. They might be about the same word, but it may not be identified in the same way. Just as it's very difficult to translate the noises bats make into to human language. But with humans you can, and that disproves linguistic relativity, I think. I mean, you can't even state the thesis without disproving it.
Can I just sort of follow on from, I mean, I think it's behind the second part of Mr.
Yes.
question. I mean, some people would say, I think the tide of postmodernity is going down in academic circles.
Yes.
It's the tide is sort of going out, rather.
Yes.
But as you said, it takes public culture 30 years to catch
Yeah.
up. But I think partly behind the question was, is there any way we can hurry that up a little bit, you know, or, you know, is there any, I mean, how much hope do you see in terms of speeding up the decline of postmodernity? Is this to be done by argument? But, you know, that doesn't seem to work very well, does it, in some ways? So
No,
because
I think it does mesh in with deep cultural trends that actually, in some sense, people find great differences in society, and they don't know quite what to do with them, so they just want to accept them, and postmodernism gives them a kind of easy way out of live and let live, accepting them without having to argue about them, without having to think about them. Indeed, I mean, that's the point, that they can accept a religion as existing without needing to bother about it. And whereas if they really, were rational, they should either be arguing with it or against it. I mean, they should think that it mattered, what was true. But postmodernity enables them to opt out of that kind of thing. And I don't know, I mean, apart from the philosophical arguments about that, well, I think just showing that things are incoherent ought to be important.
And maybe if we can just show that the theists of different kinds, or, you know, people who believe in different truths can get along well without being relativists, that might also help the popular culture.
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, one important thing is to show the roots of tolerance, and I don't think, as I've been saying, the roots of tolerance lie in relativism. In fact, I would say the roots of tolerance lie much more in religion than people recognise. That you could argue that toleration has very often arisen as a result of religious divergence and the need for people to respect each other's beliefs but live together. And if you really believe, of course, in human free will and believe that's a gift of God, then you should respect that as well. That's another argument.
Thank you. Super.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. Well, I disagree with you on a couple of points.
Good.
How to start? You have made a very strong statement. Postmodernism is as much the enemy of science as of religion. Okay, I mean, my first question is, let's get out of the four walls of the academics and walk into the real world. How on earth you can expect a rational mind, very trained in the academics or the logical explanation, etc., can support things like slavery or genocide or all kinds of terrible things which have happened in the last few hundred years. I mean, in the sense that science and religion both have failed to help us land in the promised land. And do you think that there is some element or psychological defense reaction to the unexpected, unwelcome failure which science and religion both promised but failed? Particularly if you see what happened, for suppose, Hiroshima, Vietnam War, or the terrible things which are happening in the nuclear arms race or something. And I have some friends who are strongly postmodernity, modernist, and the construction of reality. Well, it's true. I mean, suppose the reality is 11-dimensional and we can construct reality only 3-dimensional. It's construction of reality and it is relativist position anyway. So my point is that, can you find by any stretch of your argument that there is element of genuine attempt to understand the world in its complexity, and postmodernity may have element of truth in their understanding?
But they can't, because they don't want to talk about truth. I mean, that's my point. They're not giving an explanation. They're denying the possibility of an explanation. They're not talking about truth. They're denying the possibility of truth.
they may not be interested in engagement, but that doesn't mean I will not be interested to understand their position.
And if postmodernity is true, you can't understand their position either, because we're all locked up in separate compartments. There's no common world we live in. I mean, everything you're saying rather presupposes the falsity of postmodernity. I mean, even your criticism of religion and your criticism of science is a rational criticism, assuming that we can reason together about the worth of traditions. Postmodernity says you're in a tradition, you're religious, you're scientific, you're either in it or you're not. You can't argue about it rationally. Or if we have a conversation, there are no kind of rules for the conversation. Some postmodernists like the term conversation, but I'm never quite sure. It always seems to me a bit like the idle chitter-chatter of a cocktail party where no one actually hears what the other person's saying. I mean, I just don't see what's going on there. Unless we're talking about something, unless we're trying to agree about something, about this, there is a truth. I don't see what's going on.
I mean, the way that, United Nations come out with declarations, saying universal declaration, and it is kind of taking up different positions, and in a way you are right that it is kind of making everybody happy, but that's the way, the social bodies or the political organizations are working. For example, UNESCO or United Nations declarations on genetic testing, bioethics, human rights, it's kind of taking different realities and coming together so that in a pluralist society we can function, otherwise we won't be able to function.
But they're not taking different realities. I mean, they're taking different facets of the same reality, but that's different.
Okay, yeah.
Well, it is different because, you see, the notion of a different reality suggests that there's a reality for you or a reality for me, and we're in different compartments. It's like being in, we were talking about multiverses this morning. It's like somebody being in one universe and somebody else being in a different universe. There's no contact between them. And postmodernity is really encouraging that kind of view. The pluralism of postmodernity is not a pluralism where people meet. It's a pluralism where people are in self-contained compartments.
I don't think that's right.
You don't think that's right?
No, I mean, I didn't understand that way. I think there could be some communication, because in a society there have to be some communications, otherwise we can't.
Yeah, well, I think that shows the truth of the falsity of postmodernity. Just coming back to your statement that science and religion have failed, I mean, sometimes, they're human to some extent. And human beings fail. But it's a very grand statement to say all religion has failed, just because you can pinpoint terrible things that happen through history. And indeed, you can say, well, all right, you mentioned slavery, but it was religious people, William Wilberforce, for instance, whose anniversary is being celebrated, who abolished slavery. So you can see that good things can come out of religion, just as science can produce medicine that cures people. It isn't all one-sided, but just as, that's the point, though. It isn't one-sided the other way either, that, science isn't a matter of uninterrupted, wonderful progress with no misuse. But you shouldn't go the other way and say it's all failed.
Okay, I think Larissa was next. Back there, yes.
Thank you for that very thought-provoking talk. I was wondering if you could comment on the sociology of scientific knowledge and the post-Kuhnian tradition, whether you identify that with postmodernity. So I wonder if there's some aspects of that kind of approach that could be helpful in a science-religion dialogue, perhaps whether it's possible to emphasize the human aspect of science as a social activity without rejecting the idea of truth and reality.
Yes. Well, of course, like all kind of social science, there are interesting parts to it, but if you push it too far, it becomes very destructive, I think. Social scientists said to me that, because they've run out of exotic tribes to go and to go look at, it's easy to just go across the road and look at what's going on in the scientific laboratories. And in a sense, it's a kind of anthropology of, you can see why it costs less for them to do it, perhaps. There's a truth in that, and seeing how science works, and there is Kuhn did, I think, do a service in showing how there is definitely a social element in science, a psychological element as well. But of course, that isn't really what science is about. And I think if it begins to overshadow the purpose of science, again, you're in deep trouble. And so I get very concerned about social studies, about science and the sociology of science, because the sociology of knowledge particularly, which then became very relativistic. And I mean, it became, again, totally destructive, because you then say, well, let's have a sociology of the sociology of knowledge, and let's study how the sociologists of knowledge conduct their business and see their social practices. And you can have then a sociology of the sociology of the sociology of knowledge. And the thing is a regress, and again, the point is it totally removes any idea of reason, or that actually you're talking about something that's really happening. It's always changing the subject, and that's dangerous. So, I mean, I think probably in brief I'd say I think the sociology of science has done more harm than good.
Yes.
Again, thank you very much for your talk. Do you think it's possible that since postmodernity escaped from the academic community, from academia, that it's undergone some mutations, and has in fact taken on a much more benign connotation in the non-academic community than you're implying? I have a son who's training to be an actor, and last year he did a major module on postmodern theatre.
Right.
And I had read just a little bit about postmodernity from academic books, and said, how can you have a theatre which is in essence is communication if it's postmodern? And he said, oh, no, it's not that at all. All I could get out of him in the end was that postmodern theatre was just a reaction to the regimented reason of the Enlightenment. And postmodern really meant anti-Enlightenment or contra-Enlightenment. And in that, it has some sense. And I think that's why I think that's where your editor, or your journalist, sorry, may have got it from. It simply means that you don't have to be reasonable, or you don't have to use reason all the time, and it denies a spiritual element in the world. And for all sorts of weird reasons and all sorts of weird ways, people are looking for spiritual element in life, which has been denied by the Enlightenment.
Yes.
So what I'm saying, in summary, sorry.
I'm afraid for that reason, sometimes I'm more tempted to be pre-modern than postmodern, because I think there's probably a greater foundation of rationality in what went before rather than what's come after. The great problem with postmodernity is in its reaction to rationality. As I said, it can become very nihilistic, and I think you can see that sometimes in some aspects of theatre too. It's actually, in a sense, standing for nothing and against everything. And I mean, I don't know what, I mean, I'd like to know what postmodern theatre is in favour of, or supporting, or standing for. It may just be trying to pull down everything.
Well, my son put it to me that Enlightenment theatre and novels and so on, novels of 100 years ago, described an ideal world as a world where everybody was entirely reasonable and rational all the time. It was a tyranny of reason. And as a human being, you're entitled to be unreasonable and irrational on occasion, as part of the wider concept of rationality in human beings.
Yes, but well, Shakespeare wouldn't be very modern then, would he? But that's why I said perhaps pre-modern is better, because Shakespeare certainly came to grips with irrationality in human beings, didn't he? But I mean, perhaps, I mean, there is something that's, of course, I mean, right about as I've said before, right about reacting against this notion, Enlightenment notion of rationality. I mean, I mean, I can see why people are against it. But I think that they are against it far too much, because it was too narrow. As I said, it became a notion of rationalization equaling atheism. And it also had, I mean, this idea of progress. And another thing I didn't mention, which I think it tended to think that human beings are naturally good very often. I mean, that went with the idea of progress. And of course, again, that would be something that the theatre could question very, very much, of course. So, but as with everything, it's easy to say what's wrong with something, but if you're just against everything and are not for anything, I think that can be very destructive. But you're right, there is a kind of wider cultural movement here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, down the front, Christine.
I'm a little bit missing in your exposition some, I would say, non-academic aspects, as perhaps the hippie movement, with all these people going to Kathmandu and to find another reality, and smoking hashish and rock music. And I have heard that some aspects of rock music are trying to influence directly the Werwolf in German, le loup-garou in us, perhaps the shadow of the psychologists in us. And so that is all irrational, but trying to go very, very deep in you, and perhaps influencing you or splitting you. And maybe your explanation was a little bit too rational.
The hippies and everything, that's 1960s more, isn't it? And I think that's a bit before what we're talking about. I mean, I date this more to 70s and 80s, really. So, but it's all part of, I agree, it's all part of a reaction to something. Yes. Well, it's a reaction, I suppose. It's a rebellion against established conventions. Again, of course, partly as a reaction, I suppose, to the chaos caused by the Second World War. And that obviously has had a tremendous effect, particularly in Europe, an unsettling effect.
And the Nazi philosophy also, but it is...
Yeah, though interestingly enough, you see, I mean, I said that Nietzsche influenced postmodernism, but Nietzsche was also very much venerated by Hitler. So it just shows, I mean, that shows the incipient dangers of this kind of thing, because there is nothing in Nietzsche to actually suggest that, say, what goes on inside or what went on inside a concentration camp was actually wrong. In fact, it was the strong, perhaps the exercising a will to power over the weak. And although Nietzsche wasn't a German nationalist, I mean, it does seem to me that I could see that Nazis could find things in his thought that they thought were agreeing with what they would want to say. And that just shows that postmodernism isn't necessarily benign, because there are, in a sense, it opens the floodgates to anything. Because there are that's why it is in the end nihilistic. I mean, nothing matters, so nothing's ruled out either. And that's why I said in the end it can become just the exercise of power. I mean, reason, I mean, I go on about rationality, but actually reason is the only bulwark against total chaos and breakdown of civilization, if I can be very apocalyptic about it. I mean, it is very important that human beings deal with each other in a rational way, because the alternative is the use of force. It's the only alternative, really.
Yes. So we have the mic getting back. Yeah.
So it seems that the most powerful argument against relativism is the argument that it is self-defeating, it is inconsistent. So, but a relativist will say that, okay, I accept that relativism is self-defeating, but the fact that I'm a relativist means that I don't have to be consistent. So the fact that you say that I'm inconsistent, you are still trying to, you're still operating on your assumption, your whole framework of non-relativistic thinking, which emphasizes consistency and yeah. So I was thinking of how to respond to this. So this is one of my attempts. I could tell him that, okay, if that's the case, if that is what you have admitted, then you should keep silent. You cannot say anything, because the whole possibility of using language and making inquiry presupposes consistency. So once you have accepted that you don't need consistency, then you have no right to conduct inquiry and to say anything. But I think he will still respond to me and say that, yes, according to what you say, it will be consistent that I shall keep silent. But since I don't have to be consistent, I don't have to keep silent. So how
So
should we
are you going to
respond?
answer or not? That's what I want to say.
Well, I mean, I think you're on the right lines there in the way that you're talking, because I mean, I would actually say that yes, I mean, consistency is important, but in a sense, you can't state it all without assuming the notion of truth. So I think the alternative to a belief in the falsity of relativism and objectivism or whatever, is actually silence. I think you're right. The relativist, if he's consistent, can't state relativism consistently. What he or she must do is just shut up. Well, all right. Well, perhaps that would be a good thing for everybody.
But the relativists will say that I don't have to be consistent, so therefore I don't have to keep silent.
Yes, but all of the use, but not to be silent involves using language, and the use of language only works on the assumption that you're consistent and that you're willing to distinguish between what is the case and isn't the case. I mean, I don't think language works without that basic distinction between what is and isn't. If I look at out of the window and say it's raining and it isn't raining, I've said something and withdrawn it. Or what have I said? I've got to choose. But once I choose, I'm asserting something as true and saying it to you, and that's a non-relativist view. I mean, I'm not saying it should. And if I just say it's true for me that it's raining, I mean, well, that's not very interesting. And particularly, you can then say, well, how on earth did you learn that language anyway? Didn't learning the language presuppose that there was actually a truth that wasn't just true for you, because you couldn't have latched onto it otherwise?
But what if the relativist says that, okay,
Make this brief because we're going to wrap up in a moment. Yeah.
what if he says that, yes, I understand and accept that I cannot use language because of my denial of consistency.
And he's saying all this, isn't he?
Yeah. So, but because I don't have to be consistent, so even though I know that I cannot consistently use language, I still want to use language because I'm not consistent.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I mean, these are very similar to arguments that were used by Plato against Protagoras in the Theaetetus, all about the presuppositions of language. And so they're very basic and go back. But the trouble is, they don't shut up the relativists, do they?
Well, they've been going for 2,000 years, so it seems to be a difficult project to... I think this is a very good note on which to thank, first of all, Roger very much indeed for